On Africa 24 English, the African Union Journal is presented to you by Afreximbank.
Welcome back to another edition of the African Union Journal. This week, the editorial team brainstormed and brought to light the issue of deepening cooperation between Africa and Tunisia. In the face of climate changes, we will also unveil the stakes of Africa's climate resilience in the face of challenges and climate disaster. With reports and analysis, we take a look at the SADC's response to the post-election in Mozambique. The African continent, which emits a proportion of the greenhouse gases responsible for the climate change, is nevertheless the most vulnerable to the impacts of this phenomenon. Droughts, floods, and coastal erosion around Africa and heat waves affect millions of people across the continent. On average, according to the United Nations, African countries lose 2 to 5% of their gross domestic product in the fight against extreme weather conditions. Fatma Nyang tells us more on these impacts.
Africa remains highly vulnerable to climate change despite contributing only 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Up to 118 million extremely poor people will be exposed to drought, floods, and extreme heat in Africa if adequate adaptation measures are not put in place, according to the United Nations. Faced with these challenges, Africa is embarking on adaptation initiatives aimed at reducing climate risk and improving community resilience.
When it comes to specifically to climate, it's true that Africa is the hardest hit by climate disasters and the least contributing to emissions and the least contributing to the climate issues, the negative issues or the implications. However, we face them very severely. That said, Africa is front and center when it comes to any solution regarding the climate issues.
Climate resilient development in Africa requires investment. To this end, strategies have been put in place to drive transformative action on climate adaptation. For example, in 2021, the African Development Bank launched the African Adaptation Acceleration Program with an ambitious target of mobilizing $25 billion by 2025. The program raised $9.22 billion in 2023.
Africa can be able to speak with one voice on matters of climate change. But in addition to that, also to look at the domestic resources that we have and their potential in terms of making a contribution to addressing climate change, especially when it comes to issues of decarbonization.
Africa is a continent largely dependent on agriculture. For the sub-Saharan Africa region, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations notes that, on average, agriculture accounts for 50% of total GDP. However, increasing climate variability is disrupting agricultural cycles and threatening the stability of local food systems.
62% of our population is dependent on agriculture in rural areas. And with climate change, these are the people most impacted negatively by climate change who would like investments in building resilience of these communities so that they can adapt and also, more importantly, they can be lifted out of poverty.
Climate change is a major challenge for Africa. According to the experts, the continent has many opportunities to strengthen its resilience. To do so, it is crucial that adaptation be placed at the heart of public policies.
Africa is on the front line of the climate crisis. Climate shocks and stressors have already disrupted the lives and livelihoods of millions of people in the African continent. With a view of mitigating the effects of climate change, the African Collective of Climate Justice is working on various strategies to encourage African decision makers and investors to give key priority to this struggle against climate change. Details with Marie Rafaela Ndulu.
Between 2021 and 2022, Africa received only 20% of global financial flows, that is $13 billion for adaptation to climate change. This observation is made while Africa is one of the regions most affected by climate changes in the world. In the hope of reducing Africa's exposure to climate changes, the African Climate Justice Collective is leading African youth to become more involved in the battle against climate change. This is with a view to creating a platform for reflection that is sufficiently equipped so that the studies will be able to encourage regional decision makers to work more for the continent. The Pan-African Alliance for Climate Justice is a large civil society network in Africa working on climate and which is represented in 51 African countries by more than 1,000 organizations across the continent. Over the past 2 decades, climate-related disasters have affected 337 million people on the African continent. Cyclones Idai and Kenneth hit the eastern coast in rapid succession in 2019, causing 46,000 deaths and an estimated $2.3 billion in damage. Floods have affected more people in recent years, while droughts are proving more deadly, floods accounting for 32% of disaster related to death and drought 46%. Climate affects job opportunities on the African continent. Africa has a huge number of young people losing their jobs due to climate change. We need climate to be given greater priority by providing more space for young people in the fight against climate change. In addition to generations of colonialism and exploitation, Africans today face increased destruction and dispossession of their most essential resources in the form of land, water and forest grabbing and pollution. We are focusing more on the carbon tax because it is important. Countries are very affected, countries are suffering. Africa has so many resources needed to get by, but rich countries continue to get richer. Note that the African Climate Justice Collective is currently made up of 32 partner organizations and movement of women, farming communities, African citizens, and others who are fighting for climate justice. In addition to their efforts, there are already those of governments on climate and the African Union Action Plan for Green Recovery.
In August 2021, 1.2 million people suffered from drought in Nigeria, while a similar number suffered from drought in Namibia between April and June. Despite these alarming figures, the resilience of African states in climate change is low, with only 1.4% to the climate budget dedicated to fighting natural disasters. Currently, 45% of states have only warning system and are still struggling, but only 32 have data tracking systems to assess risks. The African Union signed the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and developed a platform for early warnings. Mildred Yamo reports on these.
1.2 million people were affected by flood in Nigeria in August 2024. The same number of victims of drought was recorded in Namibia between April and June. This is the extent of extreme weather events across countries on the African continent. Despite the alarming figures, the resilience of African states to climate change remains low. Countries only devote 1 to 4% of their national budget to responding to natural disasters, mainly resulting from climate change.
We urge you, our parliamentarians, to continue championing effective and efficient disaster risk management, policy formulation, and legislation in our countries and through various continental and regional bodies by actively introducing and also supporting bills that promote the mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction and also ensure adequate budgetary allocations for the initiative in a multi-sectoral and holistic approach.
The challenge in preparing African states for extreme weather events lies in data collection. Currently, 45% of African states have an early warning system. However, only 32 countries have implemented data monitoring systems necessary for the development of risk profiles.
As member states, the onus lies upon us to ensure that we are not caught off guard and unprepared. We need to honor the paradigm shift of being proactive and not reactive in our commitments towards addressing these serious disaster risks. and building resilience among our countries in order to protect our communities and in order to ensure that our long-term developmental aspirations are not derailed.
African Union member states have signed the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030. Moreover, the Pan-African Organization has adopted the African Multi-Hazard Early Warning and Early Action System AMEWAS, through which it calls regional economic communities, local authorities, and the private sector to action.
The African Multi-Hazard Early Warning and Early Action System AMEWAS program is leading the way in improving our preparedness for hazard. This program, especially through the establishment of situation rooms and the provision of timely advisory, enable African countries to monitor and respond quickly to hazards, safeguarding lives, livelihoods, and infrastructure. Increased investment in disaster risk reduction is key in safeguarding the development gain made by the continent during the last 4 decades.
Natural disasters linked to climate change cause African countries to lose around 4% of their GDP. By 2040, temperatures are expected to rise to 35 degrees Celsius on average for 61 days a year, an index 4 times higher in Africa than in the rest of the world, reveal the perspectives of experts.
And now the regional news with Ruth Musi. ECOWAS has adopted a roadmap to reduce airfares. The EAC strives at improving the employability of graduates in the region. With the upcoming general elections in Namibia, the SADC deploys an electoral commission mission for observation.
A roadmap has been adopted by the transport ministers of the Economic Community of West African States to reduce air ticket prices in the region. According to a press release published on November 12, 2024, this roadmap proposes, among other things, the abolition of taxes deemed not to comply with International Civil Aviation Organization standards, as well as 25% reduction in passenger and security-related charges. This measure, along with a series of recommendations to resolve the challenges facing the sector, will be presented to the next ECOWAS Council of Ministers and Summit of Head of States in December 2024. If adopted, the reforms will take effect in all member states from January 1, 2026. Experts believe that the abolition of taxes and charges, which account for around 50% of the total cost of tickets in the region, could lead to a significant drop in flight prices. In East Africa, more than 50% of university graduates are unable to find a job, especially in the sector in which they studied, according to the Inter-University Council for East Africa. To alleviate the problem, the East African community is developing a plan to improve employability and reduce unemployment in a region where more than 60% of the population is under 35, as well as helping to match the supply of training with the labor market. The East African community will also be looking at measures to improve the quality and accessibility of education across Africa so that the young people of East Africa can become the champions of development, technological and economic progress that Africa desires. The Southern African Development Community Election Observation Mission has been deployed to Namibia for the general elections scheduled for November 27, 2024. The mission, led by the former Speaker of the Tanzanian Parliament, Anne Semamba Makinda, will monitor the pre-election, election and post-election phases. The team will also consult with various electoral stakeholders to understand Namibia's political and security environment and assess the state of readiness of the Electoral Commission of Namibia. According to some experts, the development of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission is a key step in promoting the integrity and credibility of the elections in Namibia and in supporting a peaceful and democratic transition.
5.5 million will be allocated to small and medium-sized enterprises in Kenya by the United Kingdom, created by a collaboration with the FSD Africa, a development finance institution. The fund aims to mobilize $300 million to strengthen Kenya's economic fabric by facilitating access to credits by SMEs. Fatman Yang tells us more.
The United Kingdom government, in partnership with FSD Africa, announced on November 5, 2024, to grant $5.2 million in order to improve access to finance for small and medium-sized enterprises in Kenya. Led by FSD Africa, a development finance institution, the fund aims to mobilize $300 million to support local businesses and stimulate economic growth.
Important moment for us. We think that this fund, which could be listed, to provide liquidity for investors and help develop Kenya's capital markets. But we want to use an innovative blended structure. And we hope that that will mobilize 13 billion shillings of finance.
Kenyan SMEs are often faced with interest rates of up to 40%, severely hampering their growth. The new fund should help address this challenge by offering affordable credit, reducing borrowing costs, and enabling a wide range of businesses to flourish.
170 billion, give or take. We are not even bringing back. Remember what was lost was estimated at 1.92% of GDP. So it's not what the intention of this is also to ensure that we don't lose on the good proposals.
The fund will also encourage investment by Kenyan pension funds and institutional investors, ensuring benefits for both portfolios and the economy as a whole. The fund's first round of capital raising aims to raise $100 million, including $240 million from Kenyan institutional investors and $60 million from international lenders.
If we continue borrowing, especially from the domestic markets, then it means interest rates will remain high. Businesses will not be able to borrow. Will crowd out private businesses.
It plans to support 10,000 SMEs, impacting 50,000 households and creating nearly 90,000 jobs. Thanks to its broad sectoral scope, from agriculture to technology, the fund will reduce investment costs for entrepreneurs in all sectors, noting that small and medium-sized enterprises account for 98% of all businesses and provide a significant proportion of the country's employment.
One of the most intriguing elections on the continent in 2024 will take place in Namibia. On the 27th of November, the country will elect a new president following the death of Incuben Hage Geingob, who was due to step down at the end of his second and final constitutional term. The standard bearer for the Southwest Africa People's Organization will be Vice President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, the party's first female presidential candidate. Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah's main challenger will be the president of the Independent Patriots for Change Party, Panduleni Itula, who obtained 30% of the vote in the 2019 election, the highest result for the opposition in a presidential election. Job Amupanda, the leader of Affirmative Repositioning, and Ali Angola, an independent candidate supported by three parties not represented in parliament, are also major contenders. On the same 27th of November, 1.4 million Namibian voters will also elect the 104 members of the National Assembly. The third extraordinary session of the Specialized Technical Committee on Transport and Energy will be held from the 3rd to the 5th of December 2024. Organized by the African Union Commission, this crucial meeting will focus on approving strategic initiatives to advance sustainable development in Africa, building on the results of the 4th ordinary session held in Zanzibar, Tanzania in September 2023. Over the course of 3 days, the African ministers responsible for energy and transport will examine and approve the African Union's key strategies on alternative fuels and energy efficiency. The aim is to promote sustainability in infrastructure development on the continent while laying the foundations for more coherent and climate-responsible development. The Africa Investment Forum Market Days 2024 will be held from the 4th to the 6th of December 2024 in Rabat, Morocco. This event, organized by the founding partners of the African Investment Forum, including the African Development Bank, Afrexim Bank, Africa Finance Corporation, Africa 50, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the European Investment Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, and the Trade and Development Bank, will focus on the theme Leveraging Innovative Partnerships to Scale Up. Launched in 2018, the Market Days are the heart of the African Investment Forum. Each year, they bring together project promoters, government officials, and key investors to facilitate deals on promising projects.
Mohamed Doumbia, director of the African Cultural Fund, is renowned for the dynamic initiative to promote cooperation and support for African artists. Since taking up in his post in 2021, he has spearheaded strategic programs that have distributed $2.5 million to multiple cultural projects and strengthening infrastructures and collaboration across the continent. Who is Mohamed Doumbia? Answers with Sarah Yemeli.
Mohamed Doumbia is the director of the African Fund for Culture, a central body for the support and promotion of cultural initiatives on the continent. A man of conviction and commitment, Doumbia has forged his career in the world of the arts and cultural management with a diverse background that gives him a unique perspective on the sector's challenges and opportunities. Prior to joining the fund, he directed various projects aimed at enhancing African heritage and encouraging contemporary creation, building a reputation for expertise and leadership. Through the cultural policies that have been launched over the last few years on the continent in particular, I think that governments need to implement these principles to support the arts because, as you just said, it's 3% of GDP on the African continent and 30 million inhabitants for the most part. They affect young people and women and therefore the engines of the economy. Under Mohamed Doumbia's leadership, strategic initiatives have been put in place to strengthen cultural cooperation between African countries. The fund, under his direction, has launched funding programs to support artists and artistic collectives, encouraging the emergence of new creative voices. For example, in 2023, according to the African Cultural Fund's annual report, the fund awarded more than 500 grants, totaling $2.5 million for projects related to music, theater, and the visual arts. These initiatives have enabled many talented artists to shine beyond their national borders. It's important for this sector to be supported, for the state to make a greater commitment to investing in the cultural sector. There are initiatives such as the African Fund and, like me, the African Union's initiative to allocate at least 1% of the budget in national budgets to the cultural sector. I think these are initiatives that really need to be pushed so that we can have a more significant impact at the level of CCIs. Mohamed Doumbia has also focused on strengthening cultural infrastructures in Africa, spearheading the creation of collaborative networks between cultural and academic institutions to stimulate the exchange of ideas and skills. In 2024, in a report on the state of the fund's partnerships, more than 200 institutions were involved in these initiatives, promoting local solutions to common problems. The aim is to establish an ecosystem where cultural players can support each other and strengthen the sustainability of the sector. The African Cultural Fund aims to be a sovereign fund, so it has a policy that aims to mobilize as many resources as possible on the continent. For example, by trying to get the African private sector more involved. It was more the African private sector invested in the cultural sector in particular. Also, obviously, public-private partnerships that can increase the capacity for exchanges between cultural actors on the continent.
acteurs culturels sur le continent.
One of his key achievements was the creation of a special fund for young creators designed to support innovation and artistic expression by new generations. According to the special report on the impact of cultural initiatives 2024, this program, with an initial budget of $1 million has already enabled more than 300 young artists to bring their projects to fruition and gain greater visibility, thereby helping to revitalize the African cultural landscape and promote a positive and diversified image of culture on the international stage.
We now draw curtains on this edition of the African Union Journal, prepared to you by the entire editorial team for you. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening. You can find our latest updates in Africa on our website, africa24tv.com, and on the application My Africa 24. On Africa 24 English, the African Union Journal is presented to you by Afreximbank.